to, well, let's start. Ok, muito bem, pessoal, vamos começar o nosso evento aqui sobre performance musical na antiguidade, né? Especificamente com foco mais específico sobre a antiguidade grega, né? Sobre a Grécia Antiga. Nós vamos ter hoje aqui a palestra, né, do professor Stefan Hagel, do Instituto Arqueológico da Áustria, né? E do professor John Curtis Franklin também, da Universidade de Vermont, dos Estados Unidos. Queria, em primeiro lugar, desejar uma boa tarde a todos e a todos, né, aqui no Brasil. Buenos dias a los amigos da América Latina, que me parece que o tenemos ahora o tendremos muita gente de Argentina, Uruguai e talvez de outros lugares também. And good evening for those who are on the other side of the Atlantic, like Stefan. And good afternoon for those who are in the Americas, like me and John. So, nós estamos dando início, então, ao nosso evento, né, sobre a performance da música grega antiga. Eu quero lembrar que a gente está realizando esse evento com o apoio do Programa de Pós-Graduação em Letras da Universidade Federal do Paraná, onde eu sou professor, né, e eu gostaria de lembrar também que nesse evento, né, que hoje, a gente está retomando as atividades do nosso grupo brasileiro de estudos sobre a música greco-romana e sua recepção, né? Esse grupo surgiu na 20ª jornada de História Antiga, que aconteceu na Universidade de Pelotas, né, no Rio Grande do Sul, em junho de 2019, ainda, né, alguns meses antes da pandemia começar. Naquela data, né, a gente tinha decidido que o próximo evento iria acontecer em Curitiba, né, onde eu estou e onde eu moro, né, e trabalho. No caso, eu estou me referindo, quando eu digo nós, estou me referindo principalmente ao professor Fábio Vergara Cerqueira, que provavelmente está nos assistindo lá em Pelotas, e ao professor Marcos Mota, que é professor na UNB, né, em Brasília. Então, a gente estava planejando realizar esse evento, ele iria acontecer em 2020, mas por causa da pandemia não foi possível, né? De qualquer modo, nós esperamos que esse evento possa acontecer no ano que vem. Não sabemos ainda exatamente, talvez no meio do ano ou mais no segundo semestre, né? A gente vai ver. Vamos ver como é que a pandemia vai caminhar, né? Bom, então, tá. Então, nessa primeira parte do evento, eu vou falar um pouco em português, tá? E depois eu vou tentar falar um pouco em inglês também, né? Então, eu peço paciência aos falantes de português que não entendem muito o inglês. And I hope that my English will not sound too weird to the Anglophones. So I was saying, John and Stefan, I think Stefan have understood a little bit of what I have said, that we were planning to have an event about the performance of ancient music, and the pandemics with the pandemics we didn't have the conditions to make this event. So we're starting now to have some activity in this group, and so we hope that from now on we can start to plan this event that will happen, we hope, in presence. So also, in the last months, we have had many horrible news, and one of these horrible news was that Andrew Barker passed away, and we thought that it would be important to us also to pay a tribute to Andrew Barker. I have prepared a presentation here. I will try to show this document here to you. Let me see. I must find where I have saved the document. Let me see where I can. Now I can find it. Let me see. Well, maybe I can share my. No, I'm not fine. No, I will try. Just a little bit of patience, please. Me too. I'm starting to learn how to use this thing. No. No. Yes. So. No. There are some limitations here. Yes. I think now I can do it. Yes. It's starting. It's making the upload. Now I think. Yes. So Andrew Barker was born in 24 April 1943 and died in the last 22 July 2021. I think because in decorrence of a cancer. I don't know where, in what part of the body he was affected, but it was a cancer. So Andrew Barker started his career as a professor, as a lecturer, no, in the University of Warwick in England, and after that he passed some 3 or 4 years in New Zealand, in the University of Otago, and then he moved back to the University of Birmingham in England also, and at the start he was a professor of philosophy, in ancient philosophy, and then I think by the middle 70s he started making researches about ancient Greek music. And some of this photo, I thought it's very funny, and it was in his Academia page, and these are the most part of his books. The most important, I think, the most important, the most known books are, without doubt, the first and the second volumes of the Greek musical writings. Everybody, much of the people that study ancient Greek music know these books. Myself, I have used them always. I have my paper volumes here, and but he also expanded his researches about Ptolemy's harmonics and about Porphyry's commentary on Ptolemy's harmonics also, and he wrote about the themes linked to the ethics, the discussion about the ethics in ancient Greek music. And Andrew Barker also wrote many articles. I show here only some titles. This one, published in 2009, is one of the last titles, one of his last papers, and he wrote about many things about in the field of ancient Greek music, as you can see. So if you don't know anything about Andrew Barker, you should read. If you are interested in anything about ancient Greek music, Andrew Barker is an author that you cannot not read. So, but I think that when someone dies, we think of making some silence. But today we're not going to do that. We're gonna talk about music, and not only ancient Greek music, but the new, and the way we can, and what traps we must try to not to fall in when we think about recreating and studying ancient Greek music. So for this reason, I pass the word now for Professor Stefan Hagel. But before passing the word for him, I would like to make a quick presentation. He has a very good personal website. Everybody can visit his website. In there, we find his the references of his books edited, his articles, and many information about Greek music in general. I have here another informations. Well, I think I can. It would be difficult now to find, but Professor Hagel is I thought I. The problem is that I have prepared a presentation, but okay, I'm not. I had this on an email. Because we wrote text in Portuguese here. So, eu vou falar I will speak a little bit in Portuguese now. So, então, o professor Hagel, né, possui vários livros e artigos publicados. Eu vou mostrar só um aqui agora. Na verdade, eu tenho dois aqui. O professor Hagel ficou bastante conhecido por causa deste livro, né, Ancient Greek Music, a New Technical History. E ele é investigado. Deixa eu. Eu estou meio confuso aqui. Mas. Deixa eu. Aqui. O professor Hagel é membro, né, do Instituto Arqueológico da Áustria e é membro da Academia Austríaca de Ciências também. É um grande especialista na música grega antiga, né? E tem um grande interesse pela reconstituição dos metros gregos antigos e das melodias antigas também. Bom, depois dessa rápida apresentação, então eu passo a palavra ao professor Stefan. Please, Stefan.
Yeah, muito agradecido, Roosevelt. How many people are there around? We can't see to whom we are speaking, right? Can we? If there's anybody around, hello. I'm Stefan. Interrupt me if you like. So let us share screens, windows. No, we need to share the full screen and go to infinity, right? Can you see my screen? Hello?
Now, yes.
Yes, okay. Great. I can't see anybody of you now, unfortunately. Yeah, so I'm talking to my computer. I hate that, but yeah, you'll bear with me. So yeah, I got the task of talking about recreating ancient music in some way. And I've been in that business for, 25, 30 years now. So, right, I'm an old man and I go around my topic just rambling and coming from different angles and repeating myself and trying to get to something which will not look like a conclusion because I can't offer one. So let's see, recreating ancient music means recreating what? So I'm today talking only about ancient Greek music, which means, well, anything that's to do with Greek language. So songs with Greek text or instrumental pieces written, played by people who were speaking Greek as well. But still, that gives us an outlook of about 1,000 years in which we might be interested. The problem is that what we are most interested in is what we know least about, and what we might be least interested in, naturally, is what we know most about. So, our studies in classical philology or classics or ancient culture usually start with something like Homer. And this is a poem, and most people assume that at least the technique of Homeric poetry comes from a culture which was sung. So this was originally oral, epic, accompanied by an instrument. So that is already a start of music, and we lost the music that accompanied those texts. Another important name is Sappho, of course. Many people would love to sing songs by that most famous female composer, poet, singer, songwriter. Then tragedy, the precursor of modern opera, so to say. Much music in ancient tragedy. Aeschylus, Euripides, there might be space for Sophocles in between, but not on my screen though, but these have developed into a sort of antagonism of old and new ways of writing tragedy and writing music to tragedy. And then much later, there's what we call the Hellenistic and the Roman imperial period, and that, of course, was as well full of music, but in much different ways. So we no longer get those original composers whom we knew to have written poetry and music, much less of that. We know there was music making all around the place, but it was very different. There were new instruments adopted or developed in the Roman world, coming from Italy, from Etruria partially. So our scholarly tradition places a big rift between what we in modern times have come to call the new music, something developing in the times of Euripides, being introduced to tragedy by Euripides, but mostly residing with poets of dithyrambic poetry or catharodic poetry, of whom we have only fragments of their texts and nothing of their music. That idea that there was a big break is inspired by discussions in ancient philosophy and ancient comedy, especially, and I think it was not that much important as another much bigger rift that separates Greek, Hellenistic, and Roman period music from each other. We don't learn anything about that from the written sources. Literature keeps silent on that matter. What we see is that in the scores, in the fragments of ancient melodies that have come down to us from antiquity, there's a big, big difference between those which were written in the 2nd or even 3rd century BCE and which were written in the 2nd and 3rd and partially even 4th century AD. They are in different keys. They follow different modal ways of treating the notes, as far as we can tell at all. They're different, and it's difficult to tell why. We can't see what happens, because just from that period in between, we don't have anything. We don't have technical literature. We don't have written music. There's a gap of 200 years about. Yeah, we are groping in the dark. So what of all that do we want to create, and in which way do we want it? Do we want to recreate it? Do we want to recreate an audible event, something to listen to? So in which mindsets do you want to listen to it? Do we want to listen to it like something from a culture which we haven't learned to connect with, where we don't know any basics, we haven't grown up there, we can't learn much on short notice, maybe going somewhere on holidays and watching some tourist performance. And we won't be able to know what this is about. We won't be able to acknowledge the culture behind that music. Is it that what we want for ancient music? Something that is alien, but how would we even be able to create something alien? I bet most people who embark on making ancient music want to create something where people can connect to the performance, to the sound, or perhaps also to the movements connected to the sounds. But then there's the next big danger. If we produce something we connect to, then it's probably not something very ancient, very different, but it's something, just born out of our own minds, retro-projecting our ideas of whatever it may be, of a naive, simple, divine, primordial, Dionysiac, ecstatic, complex, whatever musical style, our ideas gained from ethnomusicology, our ideas gained from whatever on a culture. And now we might just produce something that appeals to a modern public, which, would then appeal to a modern public, and people would say, yes, that's nice, that must have been ancient music. And of course, we can't be further removed from anything which is not our music, just by creating what we like. It's difficult. We won't have anybody who tells us that we are wrong, apart from those very complex sources, archaeological sources, literary sources, iconographic sources, all fraught with their own problems. So on the upside, it could be much worse. We are on a much better basis today than we were 20 years ago, because 20 years ago, we did not know how the tunings of the Kithara, some of which were transmitted by Claudius Ptolemy in his harmonics, were related to everything else we knew about ancient Greek music. So we had some tunings, people were talking about them in academic circles, but how this might relate to the ancient melodies we also have was complete in the dark, because Ptolemy didn't use the same vocabulary as the other theoretical writers, and he didn't use the same vocabulary for the scales as those who wrote about the notations. I hope that's settled now. So a theory about this has been published a dozen years ago, and it's gone unchallenged so far as I know, so perhaps we're settled about this. 20 years ago, not a single aulos, not a single one of those double pipes, reed-driven double pipes, double oboes, double clarinets, whatever you want to call them, was actually musically understood. So we had the archaeology, auloi were around in museums, Some of them were published, some ideas about them were published, but none of them was understood what scale it actually played and how this scale was related to what else we know about ancient music from the theorists and from the fragments. Now we have good information, I hope so, for a few of them. The simple aulos from the Louvre, we don't know its date. Also much more complex alloy from Pompeii, the older bone alloy. There's now a proposal about how these might be interpreted, and we need to await further scholarly discussion whether this holds true, whether this is a watertight interpretation, or whether better interpretation might be put forward. And now, just not yet in print, but will be soon printed, an interpretation of this early Hellenistic type of pipes which is longer than the simple ones and which has metal sliders to cover and uncover bass holes which are outside the reach of the fingers. So we have covered quite a few centuries of different kinds of instruments with interpretation, but there's a long way to go. There are many instruments that have been unearthed, have never been adequately published, never been published at all, and we need to find them, we need to go to museums, we need to get accurate measurements, and then we can go on to try to understand the scales these were playing. So those scales would really give us a firm material substance on which to build recreations of what then? Recreations of what we can do on those instruments. Yeah, let us start with absolute rigor, intervals and scales. Ancient theorists give us scales in apparent precision or mathematical precision. So, which I tested. Here's a short list. I've omitted a few which are mostly of mathematical interests, but it's easy to see that they don't have any background that might be related to actual music making. But here's a graphical representation of tetrachord divisions. So old Greek theory, as most of you probably know, is based on how to put different tetrachords together to form larger system. A tetrachord is just the interval of a fourth cut into three smaller intervals which serve as the smallest steps of music making. And they come in three major kinds: diatonic, chromatic, and enharmonic. But as you can see, all those kinds were around in several shades, colors, colorings. It's called chroi. And these are defined differently by different theorists. So part of that is probably historical evolution. So if Ptolemy gives us different interval sizes than we find in Aristoxenos, the main reason is probably that there's half a millennium between them, and Ptolemy is talking about the music of his time. But there are other mathematical theorists, and with all these tetrachord divisions, we first need to establish whether there was real musical interest behind the figures that we find in the books. And sometimes it's pretty clear that those were more mathematical game than actual describing music. We also need to wonder which kinds of scientific instruments for pitch measurements, for interval measurements they had at particular periods. So Ptolemy, who is the latest of the authors in question here, credits himself with being the first to develop really accurate instruments on which you not only could test intervals with precision, but also play melodies, because you had several strings and all these were properly interrelated as well. So this means all the previous authors didn't really care about getting their scales heard as such. So for instance, we can safely, I think, exclude, if we try to tell mere theory from theory that is based on practice, we can exclude the 3 scales given by Didymus. So those get a little fewer. Then if we come to Ptolemy, he derives several scales, but when he describes practice, the tunings of the lyre, he uses only a few of them. So some of them he doesn't use for its description of music making, so these can go as well. And then others are more or less fishy because they're a bit funny. They seem to be, mathematical idealizations where some musical facts do not work out properly. So for instance, Archytas enharmonic might be of that kind. Some others are questionable. And then in the rest we can compare different approaches to what they call the same thing. So if we have a look at Aristoxenos' tonic chromatic, and on the other hand, Ptolemy's dense chromatic, they are very different. So music has evolved, evidently. We can be pretty sure that Aristoxenos described what he thought was true in his time because he was not bound by mathematical prejudices. And Ptolemy had mathematical ideas, but he took pains to get them tested properly. So we can trust both authors, and we can see things developed and things were in constant flow, as music normally is. Some things remained constant as well. So there's a full flurry of things which might have been used in practice and which we might want to use nowadays. So which for which instrument, which for which sound? Not all of them were probably used of all kinds of instruments. It's a big difference if you play some tuning on the lyre with its short blink blink sounds, or if you play it on the aulos with its continuous rough sounds, much richer in overtones, so that consonances and dissonances are borne out in very different ways. So that's the next step. We would need to see which tuning is proper for which kind of instrument. That's a lot of guesswork and a lot of proper study and research. If you would like to try those ancient tunings for yourself on the computer, and if you have a computer that can run a Windows program, you're invited to use this tool. Get a screenshot or photograph that QR code with your phone, and you will be led to download this piece of software. I can briefly show you how it works. I'm afraid it's all in Greek, as you can see. Wait a moment. It's not nice. I wanted to turn off the screen. Oh, it's coming back. Okay, so you got 2 times the same thing. So that's the actual thing. The thing behind is just this photograph of it. So here you can see the series of tuning that Ptolemy transmits. And you can select among them, and you get all the numbers which are behind it on the numbers which you need to use on the ruler, on the monochord. You get them also in Arabic numbers, which is a bit easier. Sorry, all the letters are in Greek here. I might do a version in transliteration as well. But never mind, you don't need to read anything because it's possible to play it. So use the keyboard keys. So if I choose the simplest key, Lydia, which is in the Lydian key, and the tuning, then you can use those number keys and just play around. as you can hear, that's a tuning that appeals to our ears. It's almost identical with our modern tunings, except of there's a very small semitone on the bottom here. Which makes for a larger whole tone above it, so that's the typical thing which makes a septimal third, a septimal tone, a septimal semitone down here, which may have been an ancient feature. It's also reported for Archytas, so many, many centuries earlier. But there we don't really know whether for Archytas this was just the simplest mathematical solution and he couldn't test it anyway, or whether there was more to it back then. The other tunings, let me just play one more for you, which is Tropoi. It's the only chromatic tuning, and also here the chromatic is only present in the upper part of the scale. And that's no longer the old chromatic, which mostly semitones, but the semitones have grown a bit larger, especially the higher of the semitones have grown larger. And if I play this, also starting from the bottom of the octave, so this is more or less our diatonic, but again, a little bit weird. But in the upper part, it gets really weird. Unfortunately, we have no music for that. We have no score, apparently, that really uses that kind of scale. So all we know is that in the 2nd century AD, this was obviously used in the concert hall. And we can only hope that some piece of papyrus turns up somewhere with a song that actually used the tuning. We would recognize the tuning because we know the notes that would go with it. So, but that all brings us to the second question, sounds. Now we have recreated pitches, but pitches need to be played in some sound. And so we might want to recreate sounds. And I'll focus only on the two major instruments here, lyres and pipes. And let's start with lyres. On the one hand, we have the simple lyra. I didn't bring a lot of instruments here. I'll rather play you some examples which you can hear better through the computer than you might through the microphone. So that's my reconstruction of an ancient Greek lyre. And yeah, we got most of the parameters. We know how long the strings were. We know that it's a tertus carapace covered by hide with a bridge on it. We have no ancient bridge, so we must do a little guesswork here. So I've turned it around so you can't see the pieces we don't know very well. And string holder, we have some of these. Yeah, how would this sound? So this should be more or less like it sounded in antiquity, because we have the same kind of resonator, the same kind of soundboard, the same kind of gut strings, sheep gut. Sheep are probably the same as they were back then. And I'll play us some notes and a few playing techniques. Yeah, you probably could hear that typical sound of an instrument with a height soundboard. It's, yeah, I don't know a good English word for that characteristic. Perhaps John can help us here, that tinkling quality where all the strings can easily interact over the bridge because the soundboard is so flexible. Quite different is the wooden kithara. So I believe it was made of wood. Most people would probably agree. So here in the background, you can see that on the screen here as well. That's more difficult because we don't have any archaeology of that. So we can only reproduce such an instrument from the iconography. We do have some good ideas of how the upper parts may have fitted together. Stelios Psarodakis 20 years ago has published a very important paper on that. We don't have a bridge, so that's a bit more complicated. And yeah, there's those funny things in the inside of the arms where some people think those were kinds of springs, something mechanical. Others think it's purely ornamental. I tend to think it's purely ornamental, partially because we can see it evolve and from something different and then evolve back into the arms, into something smaller that could no longer be the same system which we find here. But still, it's curious. It would be so good to have some archaeology of that. But yeah, wood doesn't survive. If it were really springs, it would have to be metal, which is a problem because metal is heavy and you need to carry this while playing just with your left hand, which you always also use for playing. And also, if that was metal, it would be very bad luck not to have any of those parts in the archaeological record because metal, bronze, or even iron would probably have survived somewhere. Somebody would have been buried with the kithara, I get. Yeah, but we haven't it. So probably it was wood as it is on this reproduction. Yeah, how does this sound? It's a bit different. All those instruments are played with a plectrum, always shown with a plectrum. So, strumming technique instead. Overtone techniques. playing harmonics in the strings. Yeah, and yeah, again, much of those playing techniques are guesswork based on ethnomusicological parallels in cultures that still play the lyre. Unfortunately, there's no culture, as far as I'm aware, that still plays a diatonic lyre with 7 notes to the octave. African lyres are pentatonic, which makes playing very, very different. Without the semitones, the way of using your fingers, especially in the strumming techniques, is necessarily different. So yeah, experimenting based on some literary testimonies there and there, but yeah, nothing very accurate. And then there's the Roman period Kithara. So the other one was pretty much in vogue between the 6th and the 4th century BC, and then the Hellenistic times saw different shapes, and again the Roman period, and you can see those in several sculptures, life-size or even more than life-size, and they are pretty complex. They have a different tuning mechanism. They have developed tuning pins instead of the tuning pegs on the early instruments. They have different kinds of bridges, which also serve the string holder, it seems, and funny implements. We have no idea what they were, of which material they were. We know about resonators built into lyres, but that's just a lexicon entry, nothing more. And again, we have no archaeology whatsoever, only images and sculptures. Basically impossible to recreate any of those instruments. They were heavier. They were no longer carried only by a strap around the left hand, but by a strap, as you can see on that sculpture, that went over the shoulders, so you could really carry some instruments which might have some metal in it as well. On the other hand, wind instruments, I'll start with one that is less well known and studied, the flute. So we have one extant ancient flute from the Hellenistic period, and this is a reproduction that Christos Tersis made for me, which is one of my favorite instruments, I must say. It plays pretty much in modern scale, with you can get all the chromatic notes. Some of them are a bit off. It's kind of modern. So yeah, we open questions, cross fingering, which you do on a flute to get the semitones in between the larger steps, or even further modifications of the size of semitones. We don't have any ancient source about cross fingering. Did they do ornamentation? Probably yes. There's good reason to believe so, but we don't get any details. Yeah. And I'll just play you something. I don't play an ancient melody. I decided to play a modern, well, not so modern, Johann Sebastian Bach melody, just to show the capabilities without any pretension to produce anything ancient on it. So we focus only on the sound on the instrument now. Right, so capable of almost 2 octaves. I'm not a trained flutist, So that's a nice instrument which basically anybody can take up and play. And the higher notes to the first octave is not difficult. The second octave needs a bit more training. And the higher you get, the more difficult and the shrieker the sounds as well it becomes. More importantly, the pipe, the wind instrument in cultural focus throughout antiquity, throughout the Mediterranean and the Near East, is the double pipe, Greek the aulos, Latin the tibia. So here's an example from Pompeii, the nice pair from Pompeii. Yeah, how to get the right sounds? The flute is easier because you only need your lips and those need to learn how to produce a note. But here we need a reed, and the reed has perished, of course. A very thin blade of cane. We have some reeds we can compare from Egypt. Some of these seem to be pharaonic. Others are late, but the technique of reed making, was probably quite constant because reeds on Greek and Roman iconography look very much those reeds do. So we have a good idea about how the blades were roughly shaped, and there was a neck below them which kept the blades, the geometry of the blades from spreading through the stem and ruining the thing. And we've sort of learned to recreate those, but of course we don't know all the details. There's some freedom in many parameters, and different players, probably those in antiquity, would make these things differently. Then there's a question, did they use circular breathing? Basically everybody is sure they did. The question is, did they do always? Or did they use rests? So rests were used in ancient notation. So pauses have musical meaning. In piping, on the other hand, ethnomusicological piping, rests are not always present. That's very often a very continuous thing, which also chimes in well with the ideas of the strong psychological effect that ancient piping had on the listeners and also on the pipers, by the way. So quite probably we may have had different kinds of music, some with rests and some just doing those ecstatic sort of piping you would use in the cults, of which we of course have new music. All those traditional kinds of music were never written down. Then the details, open versus closed fingering. So the data I've seen so far rather point to open fingering than to closed fingering. The intervals get better with open fingerings. Ornamentation, probably yes. There's a passage in Pliny which strongly suggests ornaments. And how would the two pipes relate to each other? We have one passage, going back to Aristoxenus, which tells us about an early traditional kind of aulos, where it tells us which notes in the accompaniment would go with which notes in the melody. But how does one pipe become the melody? Is one pipe louder? So it would one pipe need a larger bore. The pairs we do have do not bear out quite different bore diameters, so that's probably not what it was. And anyway, you can get only a limited melodic ambitus with one hand on one pipe. So if we want a larger ambitus, you need to switch the melody between the two pipes and use some techniques which sort of hide the note from the other pipe within the harmony. Nobody discusses this in antiquity. And again, I'm playing the same melody now on the double pipe and trying to do exactly that, to make the melody stand out, even though it switches from one pipe to the other, and using the other pipe to do the harmonic, interval harmonic accompaniment. Yeah, actually, this pipe is very ill-devised for exactly that kind of modern harmony, because the fundamental note of this melody is an especially small hole on the Pompeii pipe, so it was evidently a harmonically secondary note back then. So the instrument here plays something which it does not really fit ancient modality, but still it works. That's a very chromatic pipe, so one can set up many kinds of different scales. So we might get a basic idea of how these things sounded. All this needs experiment. It's very difficult to gain any certainty, except perhaps on the Kelly's lyre, the simplest kind of lyre. Yeah, another field of study might be embedding those produced sounds in ancient soundscapes. So we know how those instruments sound in a modern living room or modern concert hall, but how did they sound in an ancient theater? And there are people who do things I have no idea how they really work, and who try to embed recordings of those instruments within the reconstructed auditory environment of, for instance, an ancient theater, an ancient Odeon, even an ancient tomb, if you like. So this is part of the sound gate created by Rupert Till and his team for the European Music Archaeology project some years ago. There's something on Stonehenge and something on Paleolithic caves with paintings, how Stone Age instruments would have sounded inside those caves, but also how an aulos like the Pompeii aulos or the Louvre aulos would have sounded inside an actual reconstructed theater. So this is available for download. I've given you the link here. It's just a free app where you can walk around Stonehenge, walk around the theater, also listen to a pre-recorded tour with the background sounds of instruments of period, reconstructed period instruments. Well, there's another project I had the honor of collaborating with in the project of the Sorbonne, where they virtually recreated the theater of Arausio, Orange. And yeah, again, there's a link. I don't think this video is actually available anywhere, as far as I know. It's only shown in the museum there. But they not only recorded the aulos and the Pompeii aulos, the most theatrical aulos we have from that period, they also recorded by video the movements of the aulos player, and then created an avatar doing all the movements as well, and placing all this visually and audio visually inside their theater reconstruction. Nice project. Yeah, I can't assess even how well all is done. It's all very complex. It uses a lot of computer power, of course. Yeah, I guess people know what they are doing. I hope so. Next step is we might turn to our scores and perform the melodies. So we have all the editions. So here you have the current edition, Documents of Ancient Greek Music by Egert Pühlmann and Martin West. And yeah, well, it's all available there in transcription as well. But one needs to be very, very careful. One needs to understand what that transcription means, because it's not modern pitch. You need to transpose it by about a major third from that transcription downwards to get the ancient pitch. And of course, each individual fragment comes with its own problems. Things are not as clear as they look when one only looks at the transcription. There's discussion in that book, and there might be much more discussion. And again, if we want to perform this, which kind of vocal technique would we like to apply? which kind of accompanying instrument for which fragment. Sometimes we may have a good idea. Mesomedes might go well with the Kithara, was probably school music. Other things might probably go with the Aulos, or perhaps not. Perhaps it was also the Kithara because it was originally theatrical music, but then it was recomposed or readapted for Kitharic performance. Often we just don't know, so it's difficult. And then, even if we settle on an accompanying instrument, the accompaniment was not written down in the antiquity, so we need to recreate an accompaniment without knowing how they did it in antiquity. All we know is that it was quite complex, even in early times. So when Plato here describes how lyre playing was really done when one accompanied oneself singing, different, manifold strings emit one melody, and another one is that of the composer. You sing one melody, but you play something different normally on the lyre. Wide intervals and close intervals against each other. Tempo is different in playing and in singing. Concords and discords, all kinds of manifold rhythms, so that almost sounds like polyrhythmic accompaniment, like they do it in Africa on lyres as well. So we need to consider a plethora of options here. And we don't know what they did. So we need to invent, inevitably. And then, of course, we need to establish the proper interpretation of the ancient notation. And then the next problem is the rhythm. In the transcriptions, the rhythm is given. Is it always certain? No, it's not. And yeah, we get different stages of uncertainty. If we just read some Greek text in prose and do it properly, we'll get the rhythm, and that's comparatively certain. So if we can do that, and we will probably get something that comes close to what an ancient reader did. So those syllables come close to a proportion of a long syllable is twice the time of a short syllable, not exactly in speech, nothing is exact. You can talk more slowly or faster, but all in all, I think we can get pretty close to that. But prose is not really music. With poetry, we come closer to music, and yeah, I guess we should really encourage ourselves to consider much of spoken poetry also as sufficiently musical. We don't have a proper melody in the modern sense of fixed pitches, but we have the pitch contour of Greek language, which gives us relative motion, which can be expressed differently as different speakers do. But we can get somewhere, and this, it is musical. So I would like to read a few passages, just to show you that recreating music should not start with recreating complex melodic things, but should start with recreating the music that already is there in a poetic expression of ancient Greek language. So I just settled here on the start of the Bacchae by Euripides, because it's got some more short syllables than most things in Aeschylus do. So this is just spoken trimeters, iambic trimeters, the normal dialogue meter of ancient Greek drama. So I'll try to read it. Hekodios paistende tebayan ktona Dionysus hontikdebot hekat mugare similelo keutis astra beporoi puri. Morpanda mipsa sectiu protesian parei mitirkes nama dis menu tudor. Horode matros nama descaraunias to dengis oikon kaitomone repia. Dipomena tiu pyrositizo samploga. Athanaton hieras meteres men hyperin. I know the cat monapatonos petonto de titesi tucas rosec, od ampelude nimperix egocalypsa potrio de Chloe. I think we really got the rhythm here. We understand more or less how this works. It should sound like spoken language, not something really artificial. It's nothing that works with a lot of emphasis on heavy metrical positions. Yeah, what about dactyls? These are also comparatively safe because we know in dactyls the long syllable is twice the short syllables. So in the hexameter, our main problem is where to make a pause. Originally, probably rather the verse ends, but later in the Roman period also within the verses, because this became such a well-known meter that the fun of hearing hexameters was reconstructing them in your own mind as a listener, while the person who really recited them did not so much emphasize the metrical structure. That's what we get from Dionysus of Halicarnassus, at least. So again, also here, it's a very different meter. Also we'll read a few verses. That's from the so-called Homeric hymn to Dionysus. Let's stay at the same god for a moment. And I'll read 10 verses or so. Kissu komen Dionyson eripro monarchum eiden, Zenos caesimelese ricudios aglaun huion, Hontarep honeocomoi nympai parapatros anactos, Dexamenai colpois igaentukios attitallon nyses enguolois, Hota exito patros hiceti antroene ode metaritmios athanatoisin. Otarepei deton de tiai polymnon et trepsan, deto de poitides gedatyle entas in aulus, Kissoi kai tapnei pebukas menos haitam heponto, Nympaiodexi geitu promoste kenaspeton hulen. Kai symen hutu kai repolus taphyl o Dionyse. Yes, I'll skip the rest, not being underage anymore. Yeah, so here we can get them. What Martin West correctly says is that the most important part of music, it's the rhythm. Melody is secondary. Rhythm shapes it all. Melody without rhythm is very, very little. Rhythm without melody has a good footing on its own and can give us a lot of the feeling, the original feeling of the music, even without the melody. Melody without rhythm couldn't do that. So it's good. Good, we rather have the rhythm. But we don't always have the rhythm. So in pentameters, it becomes complex because the pentameter has in between that clash of two long positions. Was a rest in between or not? So should we read O analetos huie diostekos upo de seo lesum iarkomenos uta popauomenos, keeping the dactylic rhythm flowing, or should we rather, and I think that's more probably, read O analetos huie diostekos upo de seo lesum iarkomenos uta popauomenos. There, the rhythm is broken, but it doesn't really feel broken. I don't really know what's happening. It's quite difficult to describe what's happening, either with ancient or with modern rhythmical theories. And things become much more complex when it comes to things like choral lyric, where you have large structures. The structures are unique. We need to find smaller chunks, which we know, and we never know where notes were prolonged to longer note values, where rests were inserted. And so much of, if we want to turn this actually into music, we need to apply guesswork, and this guesswork needs to be terribly educated. So somebody who really composes this like John does needs to be somebody as knowledgeable about it all as John is. You'll hear about that. Yeah, a quick review of further problems. So that's that piece here, the Orestes Papyrus, here in Vienna. It's been known for much longer than a century, and it's been published on over and over and still. Yeah, it's a typical piece. So if you haven't seen something like that, you get the text, and above the text you find letter-like symbols which mean pitches. So that's the so-called vocal notation. We can read that more or less well. If we can read the signs, we can transcribe this to a kind of melody. On this papyrus, we get some signs in between which have been identified as instrumental notation, which might partially be doubtful whether it really is, and nobody really knows what to do with these things. But never mind these. Pullman and West could not agree on one transcription. So for this very piece, they included two different transcriptions, one Pullman's, one West's in their edition. And the rhythm is dochmiac, so that's some variant of this. And it's adorned with rhythmical signs that give us the weak positions. So the strong positions are unmarked, so it should be something like that. That doesn't fit together really with theoretical descriptions, which would seem to, but probably don't mean to, give the emphasis differently. But never mind. Recreating this, because Theodorakis tried to recreate this rhythm in the Electra, and as you will hear in a moment, he got this exactly against the ancient notation because he put the emphasis on the first long of the second part here, where it should exactly not be. Yeah, so we could do better. Perhaps we can't make better music than Theodorakis, but we can make better dochmiacs than he did. And yeah, even on detailed matters, look at this first notation sign here. It's normally described as the letter P or phi, if you want. It doesn't look like one. A phi looks like this or like this, and that's not what this looks. Can't be that, whatever it is. Or here we normally have, whether the papyrus broken off, the supplement takes the text, which we know from Euripides, and supplements it here. And so it should run like that, but it doesn't. It got an E here, and it evidently got an omega here, which nobody recognized. So I'm just supplying the omegas from the other parts of the papyri here, and all of them fit precisely the traces here. So again, we don't know. There's no omega in Euripides texts here. So it's all problematic, and it all need attentions to the finest details before you can do anything. So composing ancient music. My final minutes, I'll stop soon. For instance, let's take Sappho. Quite early, we don't have any notation, we only have some texts. So which kind of lyre? Sappho is depicted with the barbitos. Was it around in her period? We don't know. We have no depictions from her period. So that might be just the idea of a classical Athenian vase painter about what Sappho should have played. Or perhaps she mentioned it somewhere. Well, in the text we don't have. We don't know. Which tuning? Oh, well, we have a tuning that was called the Aeolian, and Sappho composed in the Aeolian dialect, so perhaps this would do, but it's very difficult even to see what Aeolian would mean in the 5th century, let alone much earlier in Sappho's time. So we only can have educated guesses here. Then there are questions of rhythm, Sappho's rhythm. For instance, her glyconics. Yeah, we might have an idea how those glyconics worked, and they worked probably very, very different from what most people nowadays do in schools, in universities, in recreations of Sappho. Yeah, and we only have started to understand, and I hope we will be able to adopt at least what we know about that. But there's much more we don't know. The sapphic stanza is very difficult to interpret, and modern rhythmical metrical handbooks sometimes only, even don't try to give any rhythmical interpretation of what this thing meant. Because it's easy to read it as a speaker of modern German or English and think you have understood it. But we know we don't. We know enough about it to know that how we use it was probably not what Sappho did. But what Sappho really did rhythmically is difficult to see. Then strictness versus freedom. Was Sappho singing exactly the rhythm? Was it much more freely? How was it pronounced, this dialect? And then we need to compose a melody, which is complicated. Would it follow the word accents? Then that would mean it would be different for every strophe, or the strophes are rhythmically similar. So modern folk songs mostly use similar melodies for similar strophes, so that then would not follow the word accents. Although there's no good reason to follow the word accents in Aeolic, where the word accents are determined by the shape of the words anyway. So what's the repetition instead? We don't know all of that, and we would need to know all of that. And then we come to the problem of wishful decoding, a modern problem. So that's my term here. People who would like to have more evidence that we have and who want to extract the evidence from something that we do have. So we have the text. So people think, okay, we want the melody, so the melody must be there hidden in the text. And of course, it's not. So what do we have? In ancient times, we have rhythm, the text, lyrics, and the melody, and they were in some relation with each other. So the lyrics, we would, from our perspective, say, determine in some way the rhythm, because we read the lyrics and we try to get the rhythm from that. In ancient composer's mind, it was, of course, the other way around. The ancient composer had a rhythm in which he or she wanted to compose, and then he or she needed to get the proper words to fit to that rhythm. Then, would the lyrics determine something in the melody? Yes, in some styles, which used the sentence melody and the accent melody, which mimicked spoken melody. But there were only a few styles, and others not. And on the other hand, there may be one instance where even the melody influenced the lyrics, so where the composer wanted to have that melody and the lyrics needed to fit. Yeah, then might there be a relation between melody and rhythm? I don't think so. I don't think anybody has produced good arguments for that. Would the rhythm in turn influence the melody? For instance, would weak rhythmic parts be on higher pitches? Or I don't think so. There might have been on harmonically less stable pitches, yes. So a little bit of that, but nothing very tangible as well. So if you have only the text, yes, composing was no automatic process. We can't get anything from the text apart from a good idea about the rhythm. Not always, often. And sometimes a very, very shaky idea about the melody might have worked in very, very general terms. Right, so nothing really good. Yeah, and all this is giving a very wrong idea of how these three things are related, because in fact, it looks much more like this, because the rhythm, there was a given rather comparatively small set of possible rhythmical schemes, rhythmical patterns that could be implemented. But there's an unfathomable depth of possible texts which might fill those rhythms, not only in terms of semantics, of terms of vocabulary, but also in terms of how different syllable structures, different accentual structures could work with the rhythm. And there's a much richer variety of possible melodies than there is of possible rhythmical forms again. So that's why there can't be a simple one-to-one relation between either of these and the rhythm as well. Yeah, extant melody. Many people have tried, and I've come from that venue as well, to compose tragic songs according to the accent. That's possible. You only got one strophe, one antistrophe, and you can devise a melody that sort of fits the accent of both. I don't think it was that way. I can see no statistical argument for it having been thus. And if we get poetry where many more strophes are, like in Pindar, all those seeming connections between strophe and antistrophe just breaks down. So perhaps somebody can come up with better statistics. I've tried, I've not found anything. And melody, apart from that, is very, very free. Even if you are pretty sure an area might have been used the accents, it doesn't give you a melodic pattern. Here you have actual transmitted melody, the first Delphic paean from an inscription in Delphi on the treasury of the Athenians. And you got 3 examples. The first goes downwards 1 entire octave in the space of 4 bars only, and it fits perfectly every word accent. The second goes upward by 1 octave and more within 4 bars, and it fits perfectly within all the accents. So you could compose to the accent, it goes up and down. The only exceptions, if you had end accented words, then you could only go upwards or stay at the same level. Yeah, but there are not so many of these. So accent and melody doesn't give you a good clue. So as some of you may know, I've done some work, statistical work on the texts of Homer and other hexametric words many, many years ago, and come up with some melodic patterns here in Homer. So one could see how general melodic patterns would work if a verse was equal to a phrase, or if a verse was composed of different phrases. And well, that's all very well. And it gives you an idea of melodic contours that may have been there in hexametric poetry, but it shows all the more that probably each verse in the oral singer had its individual melody composed, improvised, just while improvising the epic song. And we cannot know any. We can develop a style of singing ourselves, and we can hope that this is a little bit closer to what Homer did back then, but it's not recreating anything, of course. So what's left? Created ancient music guided by what? Guided by meter. There's still much we don't understand about meter and rhythm, and I hope perhaps if I got some more years, I might be able to help a little bit more with clarifying up here. I've tried to do something in the last years. Scales. We know scales. We don't really understand the modes. So much is missing. We have so few initial notes, end notes in pieces, all those fragments are just in the middle out of something. Then the instruments, yes, we got some instruments we can play now, and that's good. But again, we don't understand very much about their modes as well, and we need, further work on that. Speech melody can help us, but it doesn't work for choral song, and why it might work still. It gives only so much information of so much we would need. And the existing music, of course, yes, those ancient scores we have are an invaluable treasure, but there's almost nothing from the early period, so going back to Aeschylus to Sappho is impossible using them, and the fragmentary evidence hides much, which we would like to know. So recreating Roman period music, fine. We don't have very much Roman period poetry that we might set to that music, unfortunately. So let's recompose Euripides in Roman period style. That's perhaps something we could really get almost okay. A little bit difficult when you start playing this with instruments. Ethnomusicology, yes, but what to apply? We can study modern music making in Greece, in Sicily, in southern Italy, and there's certainly a lot of continuity from antiquity, but not necessarily continuity from that music which we have from antiquity, not the theater music. So that's continuity of ancient folk traditions, not continuity of ancient composed music. Ancient composed music also derived from folk tradition, but there's a forking, and that forking may have been quite a few centuries before we get our information. So not easy to get back there just by calculating back as well. So what I definitely would suggest is let's start from the least comfortable evidence. If we have those tunings by Ptolemy, let's use that tuning that appeals to our modern ears least, that tropoid tuning I played to you, that we really can't relate to. The Armenians might. They have scales that sound differently, that sound similarly, I've been told. We don't. So let's study that. And interesting, there's so many people claiming to making Roman period music, claiming to make Greek music nowadays. Nobody of them using those scales, which we basically really know they were used then. We have evidence. That's where we need to start. Yeah, thank you for your patience. And yeah, I'm finished. Sorry for talking so long. Back to...
Thank you very much, Stefan. Although you have shown us not maybe you have presented more doubts than pathways, but we'll have sometimes questions in the end after Professor Franklin's presentation. And well, I'll speak a little bit in Portuguese. Eu mandei um arquivo que o professor Franklin mandou, 2 arquivos, na verdade, 2 PDFs, tá? Inclusive para você, Stefan, para a gente acompanhar a palestra dele agora. Quem não recebeu, pode me escrever, tá? rooseveltrocha@yahoo.com.br, e eu mando o arquivo por e-mail agora, tá? Então, I will present quickly Professor Franklin in Portuguese. Professor Franklin, ele fez graduação em composição no Conservatório de Música da Nova Inglaterra, fez mestrado em letras clássicas na Universidade de Washington, em Seattle, e fez doutorado no University College em Londres. Eu vou resumir, né? O professor Franklin estudou, no doutorado principalmente, música da Mesopotâmia, né? da Babilônia, e propôs uma comparação, né, entre a música da Babilônia e a música da Grécia Antiga. E eu fiquei curioso porque entre as produções do professor Franklin tem um CD de música que eu não consegui achar em lugar nenhum na internet, no YouTube, mas eu estou curioso para ouvir. I was saying, Professor Franklin, that between your productions, you have a CD of ancient music. I tried to find it, but I didn't find. If you can talk a little bit about this CD, I am very curious. So I pass the word to Professor Franklin, please.
Okay, thank you very much, and for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be in Brazil, sort of. Let's first make sure the screen sharing is working. Let's see. Okay. hope this is working. Can't. Let's try it again. It's telling me that the browser cannot access my screen. Let's try one more time. Entire screen.
George, if you want, you can send me the file, and I can project from here.
Okay, let me do that in the meantime. Hang on a second.
It's a different file from those that you have sent me.
Yes.
Okay.
Okay. This may take a minute, so if people want to take a coffee break, that could be a good idea.
What's the name of the instrument behind you? With the it's Stefan.
Yep. That's a Carnix.
Carnix, yeah.
Yep.
I saw a documentary about this one.
Celtic Trumpet, yes. That was the first reproduction of the Tintignac Carnix in actual bronze.
Fantastic.
Yeah, but our rooms here are not high enough to play it.
Yeah. We must go to Stonehenge.
Yeah, I can step out on the terrace, that's possible.
Okay, Roosevelt, I must send this to you by file transfer.
Okay.
Because it's almost 1 megabyte. Or sorry, rather 1 gigabyte. So it may take a minute to come through to you.
Maybe.
Okay, while that's uploading, let me just say a few words about Andrew Barker, which you invited us to do.
Please.
I did not know Andrew Barker very well. You know, of course, he's very important as an influence on the field of ancient music, largely through the areas in which he himself was interested. So his articles and books are widely read, and therefore his interests have helped shape the interests of others studying ancient music. This is particularly true of the collection Greek Musical Writings, because there he provides commentaries, basic commentaries that many people follow, and also in his choice of which texts to include in the collection Greek Musical Writings, to a large extent has shaped the discourse among scholars, particularly those who are dealing less with technical matters and those that are looking more at cultural history. So to a certain extent, you know, he gave a particular shape to that scholarship. I met him or encountered him first in Warwick during the conference that led to the book called Music and the Muses. But at the time, I was a graduate student and I was rather shy, and I did not introduce myself to him. So it was not until many years later that I met him in connection with the Moisa group. Here comes the file, by the way. And there I discovered that he was very gentle, very friendly, very encouraging of younger scholars. He was funny, warm, he had a wonderful laugh that was contagious. But he was not afraid to be critical, but he always engaged in discussion in a constructive and friendly way. And so I'm very sorry that we've lost him as soon as we have. I know, but I'm very grateful that I had a chance to know him at least as well as I did. You also asked about my CD. The CD, it's called The Cypro-Syrian Girl. It does exist, but it exists only in a cardboard box under my desk because nobody wants CDs anymore. However, if you are interested in having one, I'm happy to send you a copy. You will help me get rid of them. They're mostly electronic. I call them impressions or experiments. To some degree, engaging with ancient musical documents, but to a greater extent, they're creative productions. Okay, so
I wanted to show this because I've made this copy when I think you have just finished your PhD.
Oh,
I
yeah.
have this for more of 20 years.
Okay. Well, beware of that dissertation. Many things are out of date now.
Yeah.
Now, I'd like to try one more time sharing my screen because I was hoping to show some videos that are really important for the demonstration, but maybe we won't be able to do that. Yeah, I don't see any way to do this. Try capturing a different screen. All right. And if not, we will just have to go forward.
Have we shown this?
Not yet.
So
I'm doing the download, but it will take 10 minutes.
Ah, okay.
Yeah.
Well,
the download
so
here will take 10 minutes.
That's John's big book so far. And that's the only reason why he says that his dissertation is outdated, because he's written this book.
Yeah.
Well, I guess I'll begin speaking, but I really don't know. Should I send you some URLs by email and you could stream the video straight from the internet?
Maybe if you want the first video, maybe.
Okay, let me try that, and then we'll begin with the lecture one way or the other.
So we'll take a We need 5 minutes to complete the download.
Okay. So, Roosevelt, I've sent you 4 YouTube links, which I hope will be able to play by you sharing your screen.
Okay.
And in the meantime, has my PowerPoint come through?
Yes, we're in middle of the road. 5 minutes more.
Okay. Well, let me go ahead and begin. And when it comes through, we can go to the appropriate slide. All right, everybody. Thank you for your patience. In the wonderful world of modern technology, there's many things we can do, but things often go wrong. And if you're a teacher, you know that they always go wrong right at the start of class. So we will begin, and you have to be prepared to go back to the old school analog technology, which is words, and go that way. So this paper will describe my aims and methods in composing new music for a 2018 staging of Euripides' Helen here in Burlington, Vermont, and the modifications that were needed for the 2021 revival as a Zoom production for the Society of Classical Studies, when live music had to be replaced with pre-recorded tracks and complex choreography with quasi-animated videos. I will not recount the logistical, pedagogical, public outreach, and other aesthetic dimensions of the larger productions. I have detailed these recently in the online journal Didaskalia, and both performances can be studied on YouTube. I will play several videos, God willing, both of the original in-person performance and the animated videos from the revival. In this way, I can most clearly demonstrate the final result of what I shall otherwise describe in words, and at the same time give us all a rest from too much speaking. First, a few words about what I call new ancient music and the issues of authenticity and originality, which Stefan has already touched upon in good detail. And I should say that we're in complete agreement about these issues. Many modern productions of tragedy are dragged down by choruses declaiming in monotonous unison. This dreary effect does nothing to lighten tragedy's gloomy reputation. Yet, it is entirely at odds with the original Greek choruses, which danced and sang their way through intricate odes in magnificent costumes for a striking kinetic and synesthetic spectacle. I wished to translate, use the term broadly and loosely, I wish to translate this optic element and kinetic element as far as possible. We all know what a difference it makes to one's appreciation of a play's structure and emotional pacing when the original chorus passages, and any monodies as we have with Euripides, are provided with some kind of music to distinguish them from iambic dialogue. Any kind of music makes a big difference for appreciating the musical design of the original, even when the music is not itself at all original. This effect is greatly enhanced by music which is contrived to at least evoke an ancient ambience overall, and to reflect the moods of individual odes, however subjective such choices must be. It stands to reason that such an approach would be still more effective and illuminating, or at least suggestive, with compositions that combine careful interpretation of ancient meter with harmonic material and compositional approaches documented or suggested by surviving scores and theoretical sources. For example, the so-called accent melodies, which Stefan discussed, organization of tetrachords around focal tones, such as we see in the Delphic Paean, first one by Athenaeus, and modulation of tonos or key. Metrical translation into English was also a vital element for me, because I was presenting to an English-speaking public, as was an ambitious series of choral projections that complemented the choreography. I shall touch upon all of these elements here. My first attempts at such methods were for a 1999 production of Libation Bearers at King's College London and a staging of Aristophanes' Clouds at the Edinburgh Fringe in 2000 and the American Academy in Rome in 2001. The music for this production of Helen has benefited from 20 years of further study and reflection. My goal was to produce something that would be not totally unrecognizable as music to Euripides himself, and note that all the songs can be performed interchangeably in Greek and English. I wish to emphasize, however, that my goal is not reconstruction, a term which one sees very often in the literature, but which is best avoided, in my opinion, even if one's express purpose is to come as close to the original as possible, which often seems to be the case with people that use the word reconstruction. Even under the most stringent conditions, reconstruction seems to claim or to promise more than it can really deliver, given the endless possibilities open even to composers working within very narrow parameters. Such claims do play well in the media and with museum audiences, but they can lead to regrettable outcomes, academic and social alike, and there's too many examples of this, unfortunately. My own music, in any case, is often willfully inauthentic in matters of instrumentation, performance technique, and compositional choice. Such pieces are better described as musical impressions or at most new ancient music. Personally, I see the use of ancient source material and compositional methods as a means of escaping what Igor Stravinsky described as, quote, the abyss of freedom. Whatever diminishes constraint diminishes strength. The more constraints one imposes, the more one frees oneself of the chains that shackle the spirit. It's from The Poetics of Music, Lesson 3. From this perspective, I view my music as original composition mediated by philological curation and scholarly contemplation. Of course, the application of ancient techniques does not automatically guarantee interesting results. One must still sort through endless possibilities in hopes of making good musical choices. And I did sometimes incorporate more modern elements, especially harmonic, such as chords and triads or even seventh chords, according to my own tastes and whims. Question of accent melody now, we come to again. Euripides' own tunes are lost, with the famous and probable exceptions of the Orestes fragment and a few notes of the Iphigenia and Aulus. Yet we know from many of the extant musical scores, especially those of a simpler, more traditional character, that it was a regular practice for melody to follow the pitch accent contours, remembering, of course, that Greek was a tonal language, the contours of the poetry, according to a few simple and observable rules, what we may call accent melody. Although none of the relevant documents predates the Hellenistic period, it nevertheless seems likely enough that the practice was indeed traditional. Thus, the correspondence is especially strict in the Delphic Paeans, which, though composed in the 2nd century BCE, contain sections of archaizing tonal material, as we saw from Stefan's slide. And Stefan also mentioned that he has discovered vestiges of some cognate approach in the accent patterns of Greek epic. So to posit that such an approach goes back to the time of Euripides and beyond is not unreasonable. On the other hand, the surviving bit of Euripides and several somewhat later fragments indicate that accents were often ignored precisely in dramatic strophic compositions of this date, if not before. This seemingly novel freedom probably reflects the so-called new music of the later 5th century, the composers of which, including Euripides, wished to create striking mimetic and emotional effects. It remains quite possible, therefore, that earlier strophic songs, and perhaps even other Euripidean compositions, did indeed adhere to the principles of accent melody. Anna Conser has investigated this problem using statistical methods in a recent Columbia dissertation. Though Stefan mentions when you get into Pindar and other multi-strophic compositions, then you are faced with a real problem, because if you attempt to write a melody that fits 7 consecutive strophes, you end up with a single pitch that does not change. However, and I too have tried this with Sappho 1 and ended up with a single pitch and no melody at all. However, given that the melodic notes need not be limited to the notes available, say, on the lyre, but could go into other octaves, and that we must always allow for compositional freedom and the ability to depart from accent contours as needed, or to vary repetition with variation, and the possibility of modulation between strophes. Once you add these other factors in, it becomes a little more flexible, but one is still faced with that basic conundrum that Stefan mentioned. In any case, accent melody is one of the few definite parameters we can recover for some ancient Greek music, and therefore I followed the principles very carefully for lack of anything better. Because otherwise, this way you at least limit some subjectivity in your choices. For the strophic songs, the parados and the three stasima of the Helen, it was necessary to devise melodies that would not conflict with the prosody of either strophe or antistrophe. I began by printing out William Allen's metrical schemes. I enlarged them by 200% because my eyes are getting old. And then I combined the accents of strophe and antistrophe by writing the latter over the former wherever they differed to create a master accent map to follow when composing, so that melody would be compatible with both strophe and antistrophe. And I've included William Allen's metrical schemes as well as my staff notation in a handout that I sent to Roosevelt that he can share with the participants, so that you can study these scores in conjunction with the YouTube videos and with William Allen's metrical schemes. So in doing this melodic composition, I did observe a number of places where the two accent patterns did seem quite compatible, but whether this is coincidence or not, I cannot say. Typically, in composing, I would explore a number of melodic options. I would come up with different melodic shapes that would fit the accents, but would be quite different from each other. And then I sifted through the different options that I had generated and combined my favorite and the most interesting pieces of each to create a final melody, as can be seen on the slide in red, but I don't think we have the slides yet, or do we, Roosevelt? No, okay. I would not.
No, but we can maybe see the video on YouTube.
Okay.
We can try.
Okay. I did sometimes allow my strophe and antistrophe to diverge from each other for the sake of effective variation, or in cases where I mistakenly, I wrote a strophe melody with which I was happy and had overseen something in the antistrophe. And so rather than have it violate the antistrophe, I generated a new melody for the antistrophe. And that, in fact, created effective variation. The songs, the strophe and antistrophe were still recognizably similar enough to provide the modern satisfaction of repetition, and yet introduced melodic variants that created further interest. So I found that to be an interesting approach. I would not be surprised if such divergences were common ancient practice, even if strophe and antistrophe did normally repeat. Big if. The non-strophic songs I handled in the same way. The lyric dialogue between Helen and the chorus, the Epi Paradox, and the reunion duet between Helen and Menelaus. So much for the general approach to melodic motion. As far as specific pitches were concerned, I usually used ancient scales or scale segments that are documented in surviving musical fragments and theoretical writings. I also pursued modulation between harmonic structures that characterized the new music of Euripides and his colleagues. One of my main inspirations was again the Paean of Athenaeus, referred to above as a model for accent melody. This invaluable document begins in an archaizing style characterized by the so-called trichordal enharmonic that was typical of traditional double-pipe libation music, as we know from a fragment of Aristoxenus. This was characterized by what we would describe in modern terms as a minor scale from which the 4th and 7th degrees have been omitted, thus emphasizing the major thirds between La and Do and Mi and Sol. I deployed this pattern in many places in the play, for instance, in the Paradox of Helen, as we shall hear in a moment. The Athenaeus paean goes on to a section of dense chromaticism typical of Hellenistic art music, but originating in the later 5th century new music. This second section especially lets us observe the principles of modulatory tetrachordal composition, whereby different scale degrees become temporary focuses for the construction of the surrounding pitch systems, which ancient theorists categorized as the enharmonic, chromatic, and diatonic genera. And this phenomenon of modulation Stefan studied in his doctoral dissertation for this piece in particular. By way of illustration, I've provided a tetrachordal analysis of my third stasamon in the handout that you can look at your leisure. So now, Roosevelt, let's see if we can pull up the Paradox from YouTube. The first link I sent you.
I was trying to share my screen, but I cannot do this. I'm sorry.
It won't work for you either?
No, I'm sorry.
Okay.
I'm talking to the people in the university to see that if they can do something.
Okay.
Because there in the university they have better computers.
I see. Well, what we'll do is
I might try. If you send a link to me, I might try showing it.
I can send it.
Okay.
I will send to Stefan.
Great. And what we can do, if it still does not work, I will send my PowerPoint presentation and the transcript of my paper to Roosevelt, and you can share it with participants who can then go through it in the original intended detail if they like, and to examine the videos on YouTube as well.
Okay. You mean the text of the not the handout of the entire paper? You mean this one?
Yes, I sent you the paper already, but when the PowerPoint comes through, that could also be shared if people would like.
Let me see if I can share the. We'll take a moment to share the text of the PDF of the paper.
Stefan, did you receive the URLs?
And I have sent also the links of the YouTube videos to Stefan.
Okay.
This kind of difficulty would happen also if we were all together in the same place.
Right.
Well, dear. Trying. No, this is the handout.
Okay.
Good. This is not what you want.
No.
Okay, no. We'll take the other one.
Still no mail with URLs? You sent them by mail, right?
Yes. It's weird. Ah, okay.
Okay. Well, Stefan, while you're waiting for the video links to come through, I will continue with my paper, I guess.
No links.
No links?
No links. No.
I just sent them directly to you from my account as well. Okay. On the question of instrumentation.
Put them in the chat.
Okay. Ancient drama was, of course, normally accompanied by the double pipe, the aulos. But at that time, I had no aulos or aulit readily available. Making a virtue of necessity, I opted for a trio of lyre, frame drum, and flute/lute, one player doubling on the two instruments, alluding to ensembles current in late Bronze Age and early Iron Age Canaan and Egypt, what scholars call the Canaanite orchestra. This combination, though inauthentic on one axis, functions more positively as cultural translation on another, given the trend among the new music composers of conjuring exotic musical worlds through allusion, vignettes, and evocations of Eastern music. In other words, our group let the audience hear more clearly the kind of thing the characters in the play were implied to hear in the dramatic setting, though just how Euripides might have conceived music in mythological Egypt, for example, is obviously impossible to recover.
Stefan, maybe you can turn off your microphone.
The Canaanite orchestra presented several further practical advantages and experimental opportunities. First, the trio is a minimal, complete musical unit, providing effective coverage of rhythm, melody, and harmonia. Two first-rate musicians were also locally available who were comfortable with continually shifting meters thanks to growing up listening to 1970s progressive rock. Both had also been part of the local Turkish band Lokum, and one had additionally played for years in a Syrian ensemble. So they were comfortable with modal music and unusual time signatures. They were thus able to adapt themselves readily to Euripides, enhancing his complex rhythms with both traditional techniques and imaginative embellishments. Our arrangements were collaborative, with each player contributing his own part in consultation with his bandmates. A well-focused meditation on the limitations and possibilities of this important ancient ensemble type, and what a dreamer might hope were real insights. The frame drum, with its several available tones and techniques, was vital for transforming the abstract meter of the editor's page into real rhythm, articulating its ebb and flow by attentive variation of emphasis and space. The ney and saz, the flute and lute, brought articulation in the dimension of pitch, outlining and supporting choral melodies against the more amorphous delivery of harmonic material offered by the lyre, which in my novice hands was mainly rhythmic, and thus worked closely with the frame drum. The melody instruments also introduced an effective element of heterophony in dialogue with both chorus and lyre. Although I had a kithara available, which I used for much of the composition, I soon realized that this would not serve for the actual production. It was too quiet for the venue. Its gut strings were too labile, and I would need to change tunings between songs, which could not be done without the serious distraction of leaving the stage. I therefore commissioned an excellent local guitar maker, Creston Lee, to make an electric kinaru, whose outline closely reproduces the instrument shown on a well-known 4th century ivory plaque from Megiddo. As it happens, this class of instruments has also been of central interest to my own research in recent years, and here is the instrument. And I'll play it in a moment. Do we have any video connection yet, Stefan?
Yes, I think we have.
Okay, let's play the Paradox, please.
There are 4 links. The first is a link to a search. Is this what you mean? There's an Epi Paradox, there's an Helen Paradox, but this is a search link, not a video link.
Yeah,
I'll show you and you tell me.
no, okay. It should be a link to the video.
This one? Can you see my screen?
No, not yet. Yes, the second one down.
This one?
Yes.
There we go.
So this is the Paradox. The here comes the second strophic pair. The epode. Okay, thank you, Stefan. In a moment, we'll go on to the next link, which is the Epi Paradox.
Ladies and gentlemen, for the second time.
While Greek metrical principles are generally well understood, as Stefan outlined earlier, and they're better understood by others than myself, interpretive ambiguities must often be confronted and resolved by creative determinations. An omnipresent issue is the length of pauses between musical phrases. These I sometimes handled by splicing in rhythms that occurred elsewhere in the composition. You have to make some choice because the singers are waiting for a very definite cue, and so you must come up with a system so that everybody can be together. For example, in the first colon of the Epi Paradox that we're about to hear, I noticed that the phrase ended in an ionic, short, short, long, long, and I decided simply to repeat this pattern 4 times in order to give the singers a bit of a breath. Similarly, I noticed that the beginning phrase, which Alan analyzed as a syncopated iambic trimeter, could be viewed as a series of 3 critics if one allowed the first syllable to function as a pickup. And therefore, if I provided a vamp, a repeating pattern for the singers of critics, they could wait the appropriate number and then come in on cue. Such choices are, of course, arbitrary, but some choice must be made. This approach at least makes use of cognate material, and it may indeed be how ancient composers proceeded themselves, generally speaking. In the present case, in order to integrate my subjective choices into the composition as fully as possible, and to anticipate the later use of transitional ionics, I incorporated ionics into the introductory vamp as well, capping 3 ionics with a critic, so that both elements would be emphasized before the actual song even began. So, dee-dee-da-da, doo-dee-da-da, doo-dee-da-da, da-da-da, doo-dee-da-da, doo-dee-da-da, da-doo-dee-da-da, da-dee-da-da, da-dee-da-da, da-da-da, akusatas. So we'll hear this in a moment. The Epi Paradox, the video Stefan will play, is not showing the chorus, although you can hear them singing in the background. It's showing the trio of musicians, so it will also illustrate the dynamics between these 3 instruments in the Canaanite orchestra. Next link, please, Stefan.
Okay.
Thank you. In the next section, I would like to say a few words about harmonicae, about tonal material as applied on the lyre with which I composed. This further determined my approach to the composition. As we've already noted, lyres were not used in tragedy. Moreover, professional lyres in the age of Euripides frequently used 9 or more strings rather than the 7 that had been normal in earlier times. As a beginner on the instrument, however, I decided to use the archaic standard to keep things simpler for myself and in hopes of gaining some insight into the archaic approach. This was an especially welcome opportunity for me, since much of my earlier research had concerned precisely this early phase of Greek music. From a variety of sources, including the Aristotelian Problemata and the string nomenclature itself, it is quite clear that heptatonic tunings were important elements of archaic Greek lyric, along with what I have termed an epicentric approach to practical tonality. This includes the frequent recurrence to the central string messe, which thus functions as the normal tonal center around which various modes could be organized. Messe is also said to be the reference point for the tuning of the other strings. Typically, the outer strings hupate and nete were tuned at consonant intervals to messe, thus providing a stable framework or harmonia for the more variable inner strings. These are welcome and rather concrete facts for any attempt to reimagine the musical dimensions of early poetic texts, since they contribute strong new formal constraints, perhaps not permitting such specific recoveries as meter and rhythm, but still far better defined than passing references to Phrygian melos and the like, such as we find in archaic poetry. When epicentric tonality and accent singing are taken together, the possibilities for realizing archaic melody become more sharply defined. Admittedly, we must still resort to guesswork about what exact tunings were favored and the kinds of traditional modes that were developed from these. Two obvious candidates are the conjunct and disjunct Dorian structures that are central to later theory. It's one of the first things you encounter when you start reading about ancient Greek music, allowing for variations induced by devout insistence on 7 strings, which sometimes meant that not all steps of a scale would be represented on an instrument with only 7 strings. We have already seen the disjunct tetrachords applied in the Paradox. In the first stasimon, I decided to explore the conjunct tetrachords, and I will not do another video here. I'll just show you my instrument a little bit, if I can. I hope you can hear this okay. So I have 7 strings here. I have my central one that for all of the pieces in this play remained the same, while I retuned around that one to create different modal color or modal potentiality, let's say, for each of the different pieces. In the present case, I have a diatonic tetrachord on the bottom, going down from the middle string. And going up, I have a similar tetrachord, but I've had to leave out one step. So my fourth is constructed from the messe up to the paranete, and the semitone is here on the paramesse, because I wish to leave the outer strings, the hupate and the nete, tuned to an octave. Now, I think there was, in practice, quite a bit of variety that composers could exercise in how they tuned these instruments. I think the conjunct and disjunct, which we find in theory, were probably used, not uncommonly, but really they provide a kind of a conceptual framework or raw material, an approach that could be flexibly adapted to whatever a composer's need was for a specific song. So in the case of the first stasimon, I use in the melody the missing note that I don't have on a string. The voices do it, but I wanted to have this open octave on the outside, and I wanted to have this fourth here so that I could modulate between one tonal area centered around messe and another tonal area separated around paranete, what in modern terms we would call a 1 chord and a 4 chord. In the handout that I sent to Roosevelt, you will see at the very end of it that I've provided, or at the end of each piece, I've provided a lyre diagram for the tuning of each piece, as well as fingerings for the different accompanying patterns that I used in these songs. As I mentioned before, some of them are chords, triads, or even seventh chords. So willfully inauthentic, but still, when you are composing in terms of fourths, tetrachordally thinking, you have passing notes that either combine directly with those notes or are at least implicitly combined by the ear's memory of your current tonality. And effectively, those do create combinations that are three or more notes, something that might be called a system, a systema in ancient theory. And so I did not hold back from providing chords if I felt that they were effective, musically effective for translation to a modern audience. And the diagrams that I've given you could be used, for instance, to accompany modern songs on a 7-string lyre if you have such a thing. So just briefly, the opening lines of this first stasimon. I summon you, come from your temple of song. So far, that's all just tones organized around messe. And then the modulation, or the temporary motion to a fourth up. Where on a wooden throne you perch, perching in your hall's wood grown. Sweetest singer of all songbirds, you melodious nightingale, and yet so tearful. Trembling with warbling, cheer-upping throat, joining in to help with my threnody. Helen's unhappy toils I sing for the women of Troy and their destiny, so tearful under Achaean spearmen. That's the first half of the strophe, and that's about all I have in me for my voice. So, Stefan, the next link we'll go to in a moment is the second stasimon. I'll say a few words about it first. Another problem of meter and rhythm recurred especially in the second and third stasima. These, as you know, are the stationary songs, so-called. They're the songs in which the chorus has already entered the stage and they stay on the stage without leaving. In the Helen, these stasima come, they're weighted in the latter half of the play, and they come with decreasing intervals between them, so that the play becomes more musically loaded as the dramatic action goes on. And it creates, it was theorized in the literature, and this was borne out in our production, it creates a crescendo of, an emotional crescendo in the drama, is what we found. So a problem that recurred, particularly in these two stasima, was what does one do when a long and short sequence, metrical sequence in the strophe responds to a long sequence in the antistrophe, or vice versa? Some of these examples I chose to regard as what Aristoxenus called an alagos choreos, or an irrational choric. These, we are told, are intermediate between long and short syllables. They are irrational in that they cannot be measured by the smallest metrical unit, the protos chronos, or first time, equivalent to a short syllable. In some places, therefore, when long responded to short, I treated both positions as dotted eighth notes, where a short is an eighth note and a long is a quarter. I made these intermediate. Rightly or wrongly, this has the aesthetic attraction of introducing a lively additional layer of syncopation on top of the already shifting patterns of long and short. Lines 1315 to 1317 and 1333 to 1336, for example, all end, it's a 4-line sequence in both strophe and antistrophe, all 4 of them end with a choriamb, da, dee, dee, da. To me, this suggested a rhythmic refrain throughout the larger phrase of 4 lines. But the first halves of these lines consist largely of long syllables with two anomalous responsions of short and long in the first and fourth of those lines. Therefore, if one renders the first four positions of all as dotted eighth notes, a coherent and very interesting rhythm emerges. And I opted to go for that. And it made me wonder whether other sequences of long syllables elsewhere might conceal such gestures. And so I adopted the same interpretation sparingly, also in the third stasimon, when it improved rhythmic interest to my ear, and I hastened to acknowledge how subjective that is. I found with the third stasimon, there was long sequences of long syllables that sounded plodding to me for the effect that I had been developing earlier in the strophe. And I really got to a couple of points where I said, I really don't want long here. It does not work with what I've been imagining. Whereas providing them as dotted eighth notes kept the motion moving more rapidly in a way that pleased me. Now, before listening to the second stasimon, let me say a little bit about the imagery you're about to see. In the original production, the choral odes were accompanied by a series of dignified and colorful drawings by Glynis Fox, which were intended to complement and illuminate the complex imagery of the text. Choral lyrics are elaborate and elusive. They go by very quickly and are gone. Even in English, I knew that much Euripidean imagery would escape an audience that was generally unfamiliar with obscure mythological details and the workings of Greek choral poetics. The projections thus served as a kind of visual commentary, helping to supply some of the mental imagery and cultural knowledge that were possessed by an Athenian audience. A natural synchronization of image, music, and dance emerged from the poet's tendency to organize his thought in the ode's individual cola, or phrases. The combination of music, dance, lowered lights, and looming images on a large screen transported the audience through vivid choral dreamlands and created a powerful aesthetic contrast with the acted scenes and spoken dialogue, which they clearly demarcated while equally renewing audience attention. However, when I revived the show for the 2021 Zoom production, I had to abandon live choral performance in favor of pre-recorded videos. In this setting, the imagery from the original production was far too static because originally one could watch the dancers, but now there were no dancers. So some of the images went on for 30 seconds, which was extremely dull. Therefore, collaborating again with Glynis, who produced additional drawings, I developed the imagery into more dynamic, quasi-animated sequences using simple tools in iMovie. These had the advantage of letting the choral imagery be illustrated in much greater detail, and also allowed motifs that occurred between different odes to be brought out and emphasized by repeating specific images, which therefore functioned not unlike the formulas of Greek epic diction, or indeed the repertoire of imagery that one finds across the Greek dramatists themselves. The collage of imagery is also well suited to Euripides' so-called dithyrambic odes, such as the second stasimon that we're about to see, which Martin Kropp has characterized as a series of pictures, the dithyrambic odes, so-called. Similarly, Eric Japo argues that, quote, new musical verse appeals directly to the senses, the subconscious, and the emotions. Its architecture is essentially musical, not verbal. Through an essentially musical patterning of repetition and variation, the tonality of the images can change. So here's the second stasimon. It tells the story of Demeter's search for Persephone. Its relevance to the larger play has been debated for a long time, and indeed this seeming irrelevance has long been thought to be characteristic of the so-called dithyrambic stasima. More recently, people have shown that it is in fact connected to the rest of the play, And the use of imagery let me bring that out because I could repeat images between the second stasamon and the other parts of the play, the other parts of the odes that were thematically connected to it. But of course, we won't be able to see that. But let's have a look at the video. Stefan, are you still there?
Wood-footed archer goddess heart and his hand, the organ light in heavenly. But Zeus shining forth from his seat in the sky, the ruler of all a different fate did determine. The mountain mother ended her toil then of running, a wandering, of seeking her lovely daughter deceitfully snatched away. She had arrived at snow blanketed lookout house about Ida's lips and thrown herself down. Living in rocky and snow-littered thickets for mortals, making the fields ever barren, she sat and wasted away, giving no rain to the field. Thus she destroyed the human race, nor more livestock does she send up, pastures leafy and vigorous. Cities lost all their means of living, houses tall, divine sacrifice, offerings left on altars unburnt. And she put a stop to the flow of cool springs and sparkling wells, and blessed grief for her child. But after she'd ended the feast for humankind and all the gods, to soothing her Stygian father's anger did commend, go forth august graces. When with your nation banished Demeter from her pain, leaving for her virginity, co-muses with choral hymn, and first was a thundering sound, and presented body skin taken up by the fairest of best, and once the Syrians and the goddess laughed. Turning into her hands the deep roaring melodies, she thrilled as it welled out. When holy sacrilegious things you burned in the chambers of earth, you unmarked of the great mother, own child, failing to honor the goddess's rituals. Very great is the power of one's skin, the apple choke, mighty branches twisted around, petals holy fires, flowers whirling around, circling, twirling up in the air, long hair shaking with joy, focus on the goddess's only watch. When the moon was in her chariots above, you praised your own beauty.
Okay, thank you. So I have one more paragraph to read. I think we won't watch the third Stasamon in the interest of time, but I wanted to say a few words about metrical translation in terms of what corporate people would call best practices. If a translation is to support New Ancient music, it is essential to translate choral odes and monodies to fit the original ancient rhythm as naturally as possible, and subject, of course, to the inevitable interpretive issues. Accented syllables will normally fall on a long position in the Greek, but not all original longs can have such modern stresses. At least in English, there are too few stresses to go around. and much massaging is necessary to achieve grace. I like to leave ancient vocables, such as feo, in position, untranslated. The considerable emotional weight they often carry is generally clear from context and delivery, so one gains a flavor of Greek at minimal cost. I also keep proper names and adjectives in their original metrical position as far as possible, building the translation up around them, because often the ancient name will fit the meter because it fit the meter originally. There could be some problems if you tend to Romanize a name, or if the case of the name is, say, in the genitive and the nominative has a different shape, and you need to use the nominative because that is the familiar form. So it doesn't always work, but often it works. And I leave those words in their original positions and build up the translation around them. These measures preserve at least some elements of the original sound design so far as diction and metrical placement is concerned, a valuable savings since gods, heroes, cities, and lands are always semantically and often dramatically important to the play. Similarly, if ancient phrases are maintained within the original kilometry, even at the expense of convoluted English syntax or loose rephrasing, one may hope to capture at least partially any mimetic correspondence the poet may have intended between diction and meter. These three procedures may be concisely illustrated by the first phrase of the third stasimon, which I'll give to you first in Greek and then in English. So we have Phoi nisa Sidonias o tachea kopa rothi oisi nereos, eresia phila. So we have two proper adjectives that start the line, Phoenisa and Sidonias, and a vocable follows, O. So I started in English simply as Phoenician Sidonian O, which makes no sense in English yet. But when we get to the next line, the syntax comes together acceptably. Tachea kopa, you swift-running ship. Not exactly literal, it's swift oar, but you swift-running ship was what I was able to contrive in English. Rothi oisi nereos, to Nereus' spray. I had Nereus in the genitive, which is problematic, even though there's synedesis, nereus, two syllables. Nonetheless, in English, we pronounce this word typically as Nereus, trisyllabically, even though that is not the ancient pronunciation. But I needed to deliver it in the familiar English pronunciation for the audience. And so I had to move that word into a different position. Instead of rothioisi nereos, I have to Nereus' spray. And even Nereus is not really very English, but it's as close as I could get it and make it work. Eresiaphila, dear is your pulling oar. I've transposed the words, phila and eresia, and I've brought out the semantic implications of eresia with the pulling oar, because it's hard to render eresia rowing otherwise. You can't quite get all the nuances. So any translator has to make such choices. And I find that working within these constraints provides very interesting opportunities and makes you think of solutions you would not have contemplated otherwise. It allows translation to proceed on other axes, for instance, by amplifying Euripidean nuances that might otherwise escape notice and developing them with satisfying imagistic supplements of one's own. The whole process certainly leads to a deeper understanding of the ancient composition, structural, semantic, and sonic, and in particular the rhythmic flow that sweeps along the scattered limbs of a metrical analysis. So I invite you to look at the third stasimon on YouTube, and that is the piece in the handout that I also provided with a harmonic analysis of diatonic, chromatic, and harmonic, as well as modulation between them and different focal tones. So that one, in a sense, is maybe the most rewarding one to examine. And I'll stop there because I know we want to leave time for discussion. So thank you for your patience with the technical difficulties. Stefan, thank you very much for saving me as often. And again, thank you for the invitation.
Thank you very much, Professor Franklin. Me too. I'm very sorry for the technical problems. And I thank also Professor Hagel for the help. Bom, se alguém quiser fazer perguntas, a hora é agora. Alguma pergunta? Does anybody have any question? Well, while the people is thinking, Professor Marcos Mota will make a question. It's taking a little bit. I'd like to ask. I'd like to start asking Stefan. What do you think if we use the scale that you describe in your book as the oldest scale that would be in the origin of the notation system, the Lydian? Do you think we can start from this scale, from this harmonia, to, for example, improvise some melody on some lyric poet text? For example, do you think we can use this scale, the Lydian, to improvise over a text by Stesichorus, for example?
I don't think that this set of notes, if my reconstruction of an early stage is correct, which is of course a big if, but I don't think anybody has recently proposed an alternative. But even if that's correct, it's not precisely a scale. It's a set of notes which you might apply to different scales by selecting different notes out of it. And also it would be devised in a particular period for a particular purpose. So it would probably rather not necessarily be applicable to anything from the previous period, especially if we don't fall into developmentalism pitfalls, because we must not presume that Greek music developed from something primitive to something more elaborate, as we are so used to do, because everybody has written music history as if that was the case. But now we know that music was around since Paleolithic times and perhaps earlier, and music is always complex.
Yeah.
So we may have different levels of complexity if we have people who specialize on music in a particular culture. If you have court musicians who do nothing but producing music, but otherwise such ideas of professionalism being leveled out, so I don't think that we can trace development from primitive to complex. So we should reckon with rather complex music in Stesichorus' time, who probably did produce music most of his time. So he was professional. He was not a farmer who provided music for on certain occasions for his rural community, but he was as professional as anybody can get.
Okay, thank you. Professor Marcos Mota has a long question for Professor Franklin. He's saying that he felt an American accent in your melodies. And just like the other works by other composers from other countries. We Brazilians, maybe we could compose some new ancient Greek music with a samba flavor, maybe. And well, I will try to resume. He wrote in English here. Is the space of creative performances a field for experimentation that confronts us with the limitations of the documentation of tradition? Do you understand?
Not quite. One more time, please.
Is the space of creative performances a field for experimentation that confronts us with the limitations of the documentation of tradition?
A feud? A feud?
Field.
A field for experimentation.
Yeah, I mean, yes, absolutely. I mean, you know, as I've tried to emphasize, my primary goal in doing this sort of composition is to compose, which was my original area of activity before I entered classical philology. So I aim mainly to please myself. You know, there's places in these songs where I've used major seventh chords that, you know, might sound like the beginning of Space Oddity by David Bowie. You know, I have not hesitated to do that. In a way, it's, you know, in the melodies, I'm more stringent in the application of the ancient parameters, but again, I make exceptions whenever I want to. But in developing accompaniments, I wanted to set off the melodies, providing harmonic contrast for different parts of the melodies, so that they, you know, I tend to find that people improvising or composing in what is intended to be an ancient mode or so on, it tends to be a little, I don't want to say monotonous or static, but there's a certain flatness to it harmonically. And I suppose that in antiquity, the accompaniment worked to diversify and add color and strength to the melody. Unfortunately, what that accompaniment was is almost 100% guesswork. And so all I can do is provide what sounds good to me. And since there's only guesswork or mostly guesswork in that area, I don't see the reason to restrain myself from providing the accompanying harmonies that, for me, create that creative contrast, or that sonic contrast with the melodies. But the question is broader. I mean, it goes into other areas. For instance, when I and the other musicians were accompanying these songs, of course, we are improvising to a certain degree. We're bringing in our own experience of improvising in either jazz or traditional folk music or rock music or whatever it may be, to explore the harmonic material at our disposal on our specific instruments. And we're engaged in a dialogue with the melody we've created and with the rhythms that we've interpreted from Euripides. And so, you know, there's a constant awareness of the limitations that are imposed by the ancient material, at the same time that we're aware of of how precisely determined those limitations are. In other words, ideally, we'd like to be fully limited by what we know, and yet there's so many components that we don't know. So we're engaged in a dialogue with the constraints, but what the constraints are is itself a gray area. And so the improvisation of accompaniments or the development of harmonic accompaniments works within that indeterminate zone. I don't know if that, I mean, that's the best answer I can do on the spot.
I think so.
Okay.
We have a question here by Trevor Warren, and he's saying, who are today's experts on Greek mode? Can you say something, Stefan?
Well, I'd say probably two things. The first is whoever thinks that he or she is an expert in ancient Greek mode is not an expert on ancient Greek mode. The second is I think I'm an expert on Greek mode.
I'm sure of that.
That's a great answer.
Well,
Okay, may I jump in there quickly? This is, as I'm sure Stefan has had this experience too, this is usually the first question people, students have when they are, when you do a demonstration or talk about ancient music. People with some musical training want to know about the jazz modes and how they're, you know, what's the Phrygian mode and what's the Lydian mode, and you have so much explaining to do. You begin by saying that the jazz modes have different nomenclature than the ancient modes, but even the ancient modes, well, yes, we learn maybe from Aristides Quintilianus via daemon what Plato intended, but what did what Plato intended by the modes correspond to reality at all, or in his own day only, or to earlier times? When did these names come in to be applied to the modes? Who did that? Were they traditional? Were they applied by theorists? So there's so many layers of uncertainty with the modes, and the bottom line is the documentation is just not there for us to recreate those.
And even if we took all this for granted, what you just called into doubt, then we still wouldn't have a mode. We would have a set of pitches and nothing like a mode.
Yeah. If we could study, well, we can study the musical documents, for instance, the Athenaeus and look for preferences of different notes, which in principle could give you a sense of mode. But what we don't know is to what degree the Athenaeus is itself a traditional modal composition versus a Hellenistic original composition, a Hellenistic interpretation of what they thought the modes had been, or perhaps it is, to a certain degree, a traditional auletic mode, and that we can maybe get some sense of modal weighting from those notes. But that's the best one can do, and it doesn't get you very far.
And perhaps we shouldn't even stop trying to apply our modern concept of mode, because it's not there in the sources really. I mean, Plato is talking about Dorian Phrygian, and we can think that's a mode, or we cannot think that's a mode. And I think we can pinpoint problematic applications of Western terminology in our attempts to interpret early Islamic music. And this has made me much more aware that we should perhaps not really forget all those church mode and modern mode ideas when going back there. Because if that would have been much more like we think it was, then perhaps we should find a little bit more in our theoretical sources as well. They talk about messe, all right, and it's important, certainly, but there they stop. Perhaps a lot has been lost, but has really so much been lost that nobody ever talks about other focal notes or something like that. It's difficult to understand if there was really such a strong modal concept in the modern sense.
At the same time, we have notice of various traditional pieces that go under the name of nomoi that are referred to as though they will be familiar to readers. And so presumably these were things that were more or less traditional, certainly not static, but not of a sort to have a definite notated shape. So here we might infer that we have something familiar to what ethnomusicologists might regard as mode. Now, bear in mind that the term mode is used differently by different scholars in different contexts. The ethnomusicology literature uses the term in the widest possible sense, which we need to also use. But it does suggest that there was something in the same way that a traditional Scottish melody or Irish melody has, it has a recognizable harmonic content and a recognizable melodic shapes, but can still be varied within those constraints in performance or between regions that might share the same air or nomos or mode, but vary it regionally. So there could very well be something like mode, but we have no direct evidence for what those pitches and structures would be.
Great. Well, guys, are you tired? I think it's a little bit late in Vienna now. Well, if you don't have any more questions, I think we can stop here. And if anyone wants to communicate with me or with the professors, you can always write them. Professor Franklin is in Vermont, and Professor Hagel has a website where anyone can find him easily. Okay, guys.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I'm very, very glad to hear you two talking. It was very, very pleasing. I'm very happy. Thank you so much.
Nice to meet you. Good to see you, Stefan.
Yes,
Hello
great to see
Anna
you
and
all.
the audience. Yeah. Hope to meet you
soon.
Yeah.
In person.
Yes, I hope so.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.